tell me about the name of the course, the kernel, how that came about.
Yeah, I mean, I think it fits, although there's a part of me that's like slightly insecure about it. It's like, oh, this is like a really sort of geeky, nerdy sort of title, and I think I'm also used to, you know, maybe new age is not necessarily the correct term, but I think if I invoke it, people get a sense of what I'm talking about. So, in terms of the subjective work, all the interpersonal stuff and circling, and with a much more of a spiritual slant to it, you sort of get titles for courses that have that particular feel to them. And I was sort of concerned, like, oh, if I do this, like, I don't want it to seem like we're like into full-blown rationality, but I do, and I've sort of bristled at the idea of using the word technology. I remember hearing Robert McNaughton, I think it was Robert McNaughton years ago. And I think he was talking even with Ken Wilber, and they were sort of talking about technology. And, he's coming from the circling world. And there's something about it. It's like, oh, this just like feels really like weird. It seems like an odd invocation of a particular term in this sort of world. But yet I now internally it just feels right, like, no, yes, and I think it helps that John's sort of been referring to practices like the ones that we'll be doing in the course as a psychotechnology. And it's like, yes, that makes sense, psychotechnology, like something that's happening here. So in terms of the kernel, I think it's really just a reference that I sort of see these things as foundational and like a foundational skill. So, in the computing world, in terms of an operating system, the kernel is sort of the brain of the operating system. It's the core thing. And if your kernel's not where, you don't have an operating system. Everything else sort of passes through the kernel. It's sort of the main input output system in an operating system. And I sort of see that as the things that we're going to learn, or the capacities we're going to grow, are sort of the core filtration system, the core input output system for our cognition, our sense making, our relating. Like, external things sort of come in, and then it's like, what do I do with them? Right? Like, we have that saying in terms of in circling, of owning your experience and not asserting, and projecting, because I hear a piece of information and I feel sad, and therefore the other person must feel sad because I feel sad. It's just knowing that, like, I can say a particular piece of content into the room of 10 people, and you'll have 10, even at best, slightly different interpretations or impact of it. And then you could have some people who are terrified and other people who feel really excited. Same piece of information. So I really see that as sort of the kernel, as sort of like, one, it's an essence of us, but it's also like, what can we build? How efficient can we make this system so that when the information's coming in, it can sort of better flow into what our expressions are, what our actions are. So I see us really practicing and building our own internal sort of kernels. So it's sort of those two stages, right? It's like the basic, and I say basic as if it's like simple, but the real core capacities or competencies that I think are really necessary to build anything to do with dialogue, interpersonal work, or systemic problem solving.
Hmm.
Yeah.
There's a part of me as I hear that, it's like I'm kind of having a bit of a conversation with myself. Like, on one hand, there's this part kind of saying, well, that's ambitious, like, or
Mm.
something about, like, wow, we're going to be like changing our, and impacting others, sort of like core processing in this way. But then as I consider that, it makes a lot of sense to me, because I think that is a huge shift, from going from being really attached to your perspective, or to one perspective on a problem, to truly opening yourself up to other perspectives. In my experience, is an enormous shift, and does change a lot, like has changed a lot about my operating system. So I'm just
Mhm.
sort of like, with that, I'm like, on one hand, it's like, is it really that impactful? And then it's like, yeah, it is.
Yeah, I mean, and I agree with you. There's something about, you know, I want to be careful assertions, but there's sort of something about that. And after having done, I'm into the 9th year of being exposed to authentic relating and circling, and sort of doing these practices and then noticing other practices that are out there in the subjective space, that are sort of at this integral or multi-perspectival sort of level of development. And it's just like they all sort of share a very similar core to them. And then sort of John coming in with his work, and as you and I are often talking about it, it's just like, oh, like I see how this maps into this, and it continues to reinforce sort of these core ideas, theories, and even competencies that I keep seeing through doing this level of work, in the intersubjective space. So in many ways, it's like, yeah, like who am I to sort of say what it is? And then it's also like, but I've got all this information, like the experiential, and then also, people smarter than me, the theoretical, who are basically all pointing to the same thing. It's like, yeah, no, these are core competencies, and and this course gives us an opportunity to sort of go in and sort of play, to try to build these up, to see if we can reach more of our fuller potential,
Hmm.
in terms of our engagement with one another and with the world.
Yeah, that reminds me of what John has been talking about in Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, about how the idea of domicide, and how
Hmm.
the religion that's not a religion, as we build it kind of together in this messy, non-coherent way, however it is that occurs, that the thing that kind of brings us home, or maybe the thing that we can focus on in terms of a sort of not dogma, but something that brings us together, is basically that idea of being attuned to emergence, and being attuned to things changing and shifting, and emerging and growing from essentially where we are, and kind of bringing in those perspectives, I think, is included in that. Is there anything else you want to say about that?
Hmm. Yeah, I would like have this sense like, no, no, there is something there, but it's like it hasn't formed in my mind.
Hmm.
um but I think that's well said. I think, one of the things is like there's all sorts of other bits and pieces from other teachers or other authors, or other philosophers that that again sort of overlap, and just trying to keep it sort of simple and reasonably common, in terms of invoking Wilber and integral theory, and John's work, the cognitive science aspect, as well as the more specific sort of project of awakening from the meaning crisis. um, so yeah, I think there's other underlying bits and pieces, but again, it's sort of like, maybe an analogy for this is like, it's like it's something about soup, and it's like you can add all these other ingredients, and they just add like a little bit more richness to it, but you don't have to have them, and it can still be a good and hearty soup. But you can also like sprinkle these, it's so interesting, something about soup, like how you can add all these other flavors. You can just sort of keep adding different flavors into it, and it just creates a little bit more complexity in the soup. And I think that's sort of in some ways what we're working with here, is like, um there's these foundational sort of ingredients and perspectives, and they're really satisfying as a soup. They'll go forward. You'll be able to nourish yourself and go forward with them, and you can get a little bit deeper and start adding other notes, and you can develop sort of a palette to start to notice all the different layers that are sort of in that soup and all the other ingredients. But I think more specifically for this course, while I think the things that we were doing in many ways we could call them advanced in terms of the practices and stuff that we're doing, we're not at an advanced level of doing those practices yet. So there's other layers that are going to come online as we get more familiar with these practices and we start to notice where we are with them. Something about that integration, when you're able to sort of integrate something that you've learned, you can start to open yourself up to noticing the more subtler notes. And they're also often very important and very important distinctions. But you kind of got to get to the place where you can sit down and do the practice and sort of relax at a certain place so that you have more of your awareness that's open to noticing other things that are
Mhm.
happening in the space, as opposed to when it's novel, it's just like, am I doing this right? You know? Yeah.
Yeah. Sounds like you've got to have that basic stock first.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. You need the
Um,
broth.
yeah.